27 years ago, an entire class of young students vanished during a school trip, disappearing without a trace and leaving their families devastated. Authorities suspected the male teacher who had disappeared with them, but with no bodies found and few leads to follow, the investigation eventually went cold. Yet, through all these years, one desperate mother never gave up hope, clinging to the small chance that her daughter was still out there somewhere. Then, one day, while looking through old photographs, she noticed a crucial detail that everyone had overlooked, a detail that would change the entire case and shock everyone involved in ways no one could have imagined. A mother's unrelenting hope. Eleanor Barnes woke up on the morning of September 28, 2023, with a heavy heart. The gray, cloudy sky outside her window mirrored her somber mood. She had been preparing herself for this day, but even so, the grief and heartache were overwhelming. It had been exactly 27 years since her daughter, Madeline, had disappeared. Slowly, Eleanor rose from her bed and made her way to the dressing table. Hanging on the mirror was a close-up photo of Madeline in her school uniform. Eleanor gently took the photo in her hands, her eyes welling up with tears as she gazed at her daughter's smiling face. "Oh, Maddie," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. But Eleanor quickly took a deep breath, steeling herself against the wave of sorrow threatening to engulf her. She had endured the worst of times over the past 27 years, and she knew she had to stay strong. After washing her face and getting dressed, Eleanor checked her phone. There was a text from her best friend, Margaret Hale. "You're not alone in this. All of us still remember. If you need company, come over anytime." Margaret was also a mother of one of the vanished children. Eleanor felt a small comfort knowing she wasn't alone in her grief. She replied to Margaret's message, asking if she could come over now. Margaret's response was immediate and welcoming. Before leaving, Eleanor went to the kitchen and gathered a few packets of Earl Grey lavender tea and a jar of cookies from her collection. The thought of arriving empty-handed at her friend's house didn't sit well with her, even after all these years of friendship. As Eleanor stepped out of her house and began the short walk to Margaret's, she couldn't help but reflect on the loneliness she had experienced since losing her husband. Margaret had become one of the few people who truly understood her pain and had been there for her through the darkest times. The neighborhood was quiet as Eleanor made her way down the familiar streets. The houses looked much the same as they had 27 years ago, a stark contrast to how much her life had changed. As she approached Margaret's house, just a few blocks from her own, she saw the front door open before she even had a chance to knock. Margaret greeted her with a warm, understanding smile and enveloped her in a comforting hug. "Come in, Ellie," she said softly, ushering Eleanor inside. Eleanor handed Margaret the cookie jar and tea packets as they made their way to the kitchen. Margaret busied herself with boiling water for the tea while Eleanor settled onto the living room sofa. The familiar surroundings of Margaret's home provided a small measure of comfort on this difficult day. As they waited for the water to boil, Margaret turned to Eleanor and asked gently, "How are you doing?" Eleanor sighed, her eyes downcast. "I'm trying to keep up, you know how it is. This day is always the hardest." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Even though I've learned to live with it, the past still haunts me, especially today." Margaret nodded in understanding. "It's the same for me," she admitted. "Remember, I completed my therapy last year. While I've accepted the past and tried to rein in all the what-ifs that would eat me alive, I can't deny that this day is especially hard. I'm not sure if that means I need to go back to therapy." The kettle whistled, and Margaret poured the hot water into 2 cups, bringing them to the coffee table in front of the sofa. The comforting aroma of Earl Grey and lavender filled the air, providing a small moment of peace in the midst of their shared grief. As they sat together, sipping their tea, Eleanor felt grateful for Margaret's presence. They had formed a bond through their shared tragedy, supporting each other through the years when it seemed like no one else could truly understand their pain. The weight of their loss hung heavy in the air, but there was also a sense of solidarity, a reminder that they were not alone in their grief. Margaret set her teacup down and turned to Eleanor with a gentle smile. "You know, my psychologist told me something that's been helpful," she said. "We should face our pain whenever it comes and accept it as part of ourselves, not try to hide or bypass it." Margaret paused, considering her next words carefully. "I was thinking, maybe we could look at some photos together. If you're up for it, of course." Eleanor took another sip of her tea, letting the warm liquid soothe her. After a moment, she nodded. "I think that might be good," she said softly. Margaret stood up and walked to the TV cabinet, pulling out a photo album. She returned to the sofa and sat close to Eleanor, placing the album between them. As they began to flip through the pages, a flood of memories washed over them. The photos chronicled happier times, their children's first day of school, birthday parties, and family picnics. Eleanor and Margaret found themselves sharing stories and reminiscing about the past, their voices a mixture of laughter and tears. "Do you remember when Maddie and Olivia first started at that school?" Eleanor asked, pointing to a picture of the two girls in their uniforms. Margaret nodded, a wistful smile on her face. "Fifth grade, wasn't it? The school had only been open for 2 years at that point." "That's right," Eleanor confirmed. "I remember how small the class was at first, just 6 students. But by the end of that year, it had grown to 15. The school really put a lot of effort into marketing, didn't they?" Margaret mused. All those discounted fees to attract parents. They continued to flip through the album when Eleanor's eye was suddenly drawn to a photo she had never seen before. It showed Maddie and Olivia along with some of their classmates working on a science project during the school fair. The children's faces were alight with enthusiasm, completely unaware of the tragedy that would befall them. "This picture, it's beautiful," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get it from?" Margaret looked at the photo and explained, "I received it from the police a few months ago. Since the case went cold, they allowed parents to collect copies of evidence materials. I went down to the station and requested everything they had." Eleanor was surprised. "I didn't know we could do that. If I had known, I would have asked for copies too." Margaret gave her a sad smile. "Maybe it's better that you didn't. To be honest, having all this evidence, it's made it harder for me to move on." As they continued to look through the photos, Eleanor came across another unfamiliar image. It was a class picture taken in front of a yellow school bus, the very bus that had taken the children on that fateful trip. As she studied the photo, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Why was Principal Lillian Brooks in this picture? The presence of the principal in the photo raised questions she had never considered before. It was the beginning of an unraveling mystery that would lead Eleanor down a path she never expected, a path that would finally bring the truth to light.